First up, we have Angelica van Goor, and she is with USDA-NIFA as a national program leader.
Thank you, Kaylee. Just click. Okay, good morning, everyone. Hope you had a nice break. Thank you to the organizers of this symposium, and congratulations, Dr. Lamont, on your retirement. It's really an honor and a pleasure to provide this presentation today. And it wasn't easy coming up with, it's kind of sentimental, but it's also science focused and future focused. So today I'm going to talk. We were asked as trainees to speak about what we've been doing since leaving Sue's lab. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that I was involved with and the science portion of things before coming to my current position as a national program leader at USDA-NIFA. So I am a Youper. I grew up in a really small town. Went to community college and was majoring in biomedical sciences when I first came to Iowa State in 2010 with a NSF REU with Max Rothschild, who was coordinating that program in biotechnology. And I worked with Chris Tuggle during that experience. And I really think of this really important research experience as the spark that lit my flame for research. It was so important and exciting to be in the Department of Animal Science that I ended up coming back as a PhD student and a National Needs Fellow, rotated through Jim Reese's lab, Jack Decker's lab, Sue Lamont's, and ended up joining her lab in 2012. It was such a wonderful experience being a student with Sue. She gave me the opportunity not only to travel out of the country for the first time with Max and Carl and Chris Ashwell. We went to Uganda, Africa. It was my first international experience, but I also lived in Edinburgh, Scotland for 6 months during my PhD, which was extremely important and incredible. So I finished up Sue's lab in 2016 and did a 2-year postdoc in the Department of Food Science, and then kind of transitioned to Washington, D.C. as a AAAS Science Policy Fellow. And that's kind of the segue that led into the more administrative functions that I've been involved with since. But in between there, I did have the pleasure of working with Joan Lunny. A lot of you know her at ARS in Beltsville working on PRRS. And so since 2021, then I've been a national program leader at NIFA. And you can see I did my science policy fellowship at that agency. So there's kind of like an internship and then position trajectory there. So let's see if this is, so I do have 2 slides about what we did in Sue's lab, which was the genomics of heat, stress, and immune response in poultry. And Hoi-Jun had talked about that somewhat. And so we were looking at the population level of these advanced intercrossed lines, production, physiology, the tissue level, and the cellular level. And Sue always said, and I think this was really smart when she was mentoring her PhD students, she said, the only permanent record we leave as scientists is in publications. But I also think the people, right, that you impact and your students matter as well. But our emphasis then in this collaborations together, and we still published a paper like last year as well, so that these continue, but growth, things that are important to the industry, as well as basic science, growth and digestibility, feed efficiency, but also animal health. And so kind of a wide variety of different topics that she allowed exposure to in her lab. So then when moving to my postdoc after working with Sue, expanded somewhat in the research scope and focus, like Missy was talking about, on vaccine development in poultry, but also in mice. So we were looking at developing vaccines for avian pathogenic E. coli in chicken, and also looking at the difference between cage and cage-free hens on commercial poultry farms. And so that was a really great experience because, you know, to be out there and working with the commercial farmers was a unique aspect of that position. And that was with Dr. Mela Malata in food sciences. So our emphasis there was really on animal health. We looked at the microbiome in those areas, vaccines, probiotics, food, and even food safety and transmission for other pathogens that are in the animals and can cause, for example, urinary tract infections in humans, and like Missy said, lay dormant and may not be a problem in the animals, but then become a problem in humans. So during then the research and ARS Beltsville, where Demarius is now, working with Joan Lunny, I transitioned from poultry and kind of mouse models and things like that to porcine reproductive and respiratory syndrome. And this was a fun project because I worked on this during my research rotation with Jack Decker. So it was kind of bringing back to that PRRS Host Genetics Consortium and all the work that they had done with you know, using production lines and collaborating with industry. And so we were looking at the reproductive side of PRRS, but also the growth side of PRRS. And so PRRS is really interesting in that a mom that's infected with PRRS can have very differential responses in the fetuses to that infection. So some of the fetuses in utero during infection will be completely fine and be viable at birth and not shedding virus at all, whereas others will die in utero. So we were looking at the transcriptome changes that may explain some of those differences in response to infection. So that kind of disease focus, but also neuroendocrine and genomics of favorable responses to PRRS. And so that was during COVID. I was with Joan, let's see, it was 2019 through just 2021. And we had so much fun in her group during COVID. We said, what are we going to do? Everybody is banned from the lab. And we decided as a group to write the swine as a biomedical model paper that was published in Science Technologies. And that was a really fun experience because trying to take it from poultry, but also looking at swine and the impact that it can have on the biomedical community. And so we continue to collaborate. I continue to collaborate with with Joan as well, you know, being a collaborator on her PhD students' projects and helping with those aspects too. So transitioning from research then to policy, I love this picture because it shows the sheer number of folks that the AAAS Science Policy Fellowship brings into DC every single year. So every class is about 150 people. I'm standing there in the first row, so proud, like fifth or sixth from the right. And it's a really fun program because 1 or 2 years, and it brings PhD scientists into the federal government to try to help with policy development and bring science to policy programs. And so I was mutually matched with USDA-NIFA and worked there in the animal breeding and genetics programs, looking at newer technologies, the portfolio evaluation for our programs and projects, and helped with the animal genome blueprint dissemination efforts as well. And so this was a really positive experience, and one of the main reasons I came back to the agency then in my current position. So now I work at NIFA, National Institute of Food and Agriculture. So this is administrative. It's the funding branch of USDA. It's like Missy's at the research branch, ARS, I'm at NIFA, the funding branch of things. So we run grant review panels. We provide funding and leadership to different programs. And our biggest program is the Agriculture and Food Research Initiative, or we call it AFRI. So that's about a $500 million program in the last fiscal year. So I work in my area of training. I work in the Division of Animal Systems. You can see NIFA focuses on a wide variety of programs that are relevant to agriculture, you know, plants and business, education, farming, ranching, etc. But I'm in the Division of Animal Systems. And so I lead the Animal Breeding and Genetics program at the agency and the Interdisciplinary Engagement in Animal Systems program there. But in our division, we also fund animal health, reproduction, growth, nutrition, lactation, ag biosecurity. And I contribute as needed to those other programs, but my main focus is on animal breeding and genetics. So those are the programs. And as a national program leader, then I help write the requests for applications or help set the priorities for what is invited into the program to be considered for funding. You know, I run the research panels with help from academic panel managers, and I live in Columbia, Missouri with my family and work 100% remotely, as does 95% of the agency. So I also work in the Ag Genome to Phenome Initiative. Iowa State was a huge leader in that program. Chris Tuggle, with strong representation, and Jack Deckers on the animal side of things, but Pat Schnabel was the project director for that. So I co-manage that program, work on the Open Data Framework program. So really bringing in my background to those programs, and then have the pleasure of serving as multi-state committee rep. So many of you are familiar with those national groups, that regional or national groups that come together, and I provide the administrative support from the funding side of things. So it's also, I also like to do extra projects, of course. You know, that's part of service training. You can't just do your job, you got to do extra things. And one side project that I do at the agency is looking at our funding portfolios. And this particular project is focusing on the difference between funding of women versus men in our animal systems programs. And so this was presented at ASAS this past year, and it's being written up for publication right now. But some, you know, portfolio analysis and trying to bring some science into what's happening in the policy side of things as well, looking at our panels and funding success and potential bias and things like that. All right, so as far as future perspectives on animal breeding and genetics, so that was the topic Jack asked me to talk about. And one important thing, and a lot of questions I get from folks, is how are priorities set at the funding level side of things for what gets funded in the field of animal genetics? And this is the reality of it. So at NIFA, funding priorities are set, number one, by Congress. So we're the executive branch of the government. Congress gives us the money. They're the legislative folks. So they can pass bills that require us to create programs or special emphasis areas. Like, for example, avian influenza. Congress appropriated a $10 million influx of funding that was jointly administered through APHIS and NIFA to address specifically avian influenza this past funding cycle. So we had an influx of $10 million from Congress. They said, we want you to fund projects that are focused on this area. And so those are being reviewed right now during this panel season and will be funded soon. The current political administration has a huge influence on our funding priorities as well, and can impact animal genetics. So USDA, you know, there's all these documents, right? There's strategic plans, but they actually do influence our funding priorities in the areas that are set. And so if you're interested in maybe what may be coming up with different funding opportunities, one thing you can do is look at some of these plans, because at NIFA, what happens in a new administration, when there are priorities, then we have teams that work together within the agency to develop priorities and change funding programs to address the current administration priority. So for example, climate change has been a huge priority in this administration. We had a climate change team and we changed all of our funding portfolios and, you know, tried to get more applications that focus on climate, which is obviously important. And part of my training with Sue, and that was almost 10 years ago, right? So stakeholder input is also really important. And so historically in the animal breeding and genetics programs, for the past 15 years or so, the USDA Animal Genome Blueprint has highly influenced our programs and shaped the funding areas in the agency. And so genomics used to be anybody who was doing genomics to solve any problem used to come into the animal breeding and genetics program. And Chris and I were talking about this earlier, but about 5-6 years ago, that changed. And instead of everybody who's doing genomics goes to one program, now genomics is more tools, basic understanding, but also applied sciences as well. But the other disciplinary programs in the division can also accept applications that focus on genetics. So it's really been widespread throughout our different funding opportunities. And a lot of that has to do with the availability of tools, the resources, the knowledge, and people implementing what was previously done for the program. So people like me, so NIFA program staff, policy, leadership also work together to change programs. And AFRI, our biggest program, tends to be the most flexible. And so if there are specific needs or changes or problems, that's a good place to look and communicate and provide that stakeholder input. And stakeholders we view as anybody who can be impacted from the funding standpoint. So private industry, academics, you know, public people who do not perform the research, right, are all part of our stakeholder groups. Although we have like, I don't know, it's 800 stakeholders officially listed for NIFA. So there's a lot of input that we get. But the priorities are really valuable because once a priority is set in our funding programs, then proposals are based completely on scientific merit. So if a proposal, you know, depending on, they could be doing functional annotation of animal genomes, right? Or looking at salmonella. And if they're in the same program, it's all science-based. And so we don't change our funding decisions based on meeting specific priorities. We fund from the top ranked all the way down until we don't have any money left. So the priorities are extremely important for the future of animal genetics and making sure we know what's important to be funded. We know what emphasis areas should be placed on those portfolios. So previously, the Animal Genome Blueprint was focused on genomes, getting the infrastructure together to have assembled and well annotated as they could at the time, genomes for all the different major species and some of the minor species. And currently we're in the second era of the Animal Genome Blueprint. So we're kind of right in the middle of this. And this was a community effort. So there was public or private company input. I think, you know, Janet and I talk about this all the time. How do we get more private company input as well into these plans and better representation? So USDA is having the correct priorities, but they did have some private industry input on that blueprint. And then academics came together. Jim Risi was really a driver of this effort, Cared Rexra, Lakshmi, Matakamali. So it's a collaboration between USDA, ARS, and NIFA to set our funding priorities. So currently those priorities, precision selection and management, you know, incorporating new technologies into animal breeding and genetics, functional annotation of animal genomes. So understanding the biology, host-pathogen interactions will continue to be an area of emphasis, right, with rapid disease outbreaks coming and how we can breed more resilient animals. Phenotyping, microbiome, and then of course we can't continue animal breeding and genetics without having the proper infrastructure. So one major role of the university then is training the next generation of scientists. And Sue has done such a great job of that. But also having the genome assemblies correct and the tools and investing that money to have the infrastructure available, computation and bioinformatic training, germplasm storage. USDA ARS has the germplasm storage facility that they manage. And, you know, this is a 10-year plan. So the science is always going to be evolving, right? And the priorities are always going to be changing. And so I think that there's potential to have the next animal genome blueprint. We're having talks at ARS and NIFA now starting to move forward on this. And, you know, we would love to have input from as many people as possible in where we need to go with the field and what needs to be emphasized more, or which areas did we not do well enough, right? Looking back at, okay, we said we'll fund germplasm for poultry, right? Did we get many applications for that? Did we have much success in that area? So not just forgetting everything else, but moving forward, I think is really important. And I am open to listening to some of those comments from people, right? If you have them separately from the blueprint meetings or things like that, but also just one-on-one. So some of the challenges that I see faced by agriculture that get a lot of support from the administration and the funding side of things, that's been pretty consistent. You know, focusing on the interdisciplinary training, selecting for higher productivity animals, right? And making sure that it's cost effective, the methods that we're using, it could be implemented and it's relevant to the industry. Looking at climate change, of course, this was a huge priority in the current administration, but it was also a priority in the last one, in the science funding area side of things. We didn't slash all of our climate programs in the last administration. They were still there to support researchers, but this one definitely has more emphasis. One Health and improving animal health, resiliency, and the tools, resources, and field implementation of the technologies is really continues to be important. And I don't see huge changes in, you know, the appetite for any of these particular topics, but of course there's going to be new ones as well. So the academic and private sectors need to continue to work together, of course, to enhance collaborations, and we can do a better job on the NIFA side of things. You know, one of the challenges is just getting out to meetings and having some face-to-face conversations. Our travel budgets are not great. Me and Missy Damaris, we're talking about USDA, you know, sometimes when the budget gets cut, one of the first things the admin does is reduce our travel budgets. And so, you know, making a more concerted effort to get feedback from folks in person, but also outside of the in-person opportunities is really important. So, you know, federal funds from the public taxpayer dollars, they should benefit the public and the stakeholders. And even in our largest programs, a lot of people don't realize this at USDA, but we are congressionally mandated to spend 60% of our money on basic science research, right? With the idea that we will have that portion of the pipeline supported. Of course, we work with National Science Foundation as well on the basic research, but then, you know, adding in some applied research and then hoping those basic research efforts will then be used by the industry and be useful to people. I think we need to continue to engage in conferences. The Animal Breeding and Genetics program recently funded a research coordination network in animal breeding and genetics. And so that group is really starting to get off the ground. Their focus is on precision animal management. They're doing some functional annotation of animal genomes. 3D biology, I believe, and then more applied side and training as well. So I think being aware of, they're looking for advisory board members. They're from the industry. They're looking for people to provide input and be part of that coordination network. As we transition from the previous National Animal Genome Research Support Network, NRSP8, to the kind of new field that we're going into now, that coordination network is going to be really important. And then multi-state committees, stakeholder input opportunities like the Animal Genome Blueprint are really important on our end. Continue with the infrastructure and the data science side of things. Sometimes it's easy to just look at all of the brand new areas, but we try to provide continuity to the basics as well, to keep that solid infrastructure, funding researchers to do the data algorithms and things like that to support animal breeding and genetics, and continue to support the next generation of scientists in animal genetics is, of course, extremely important. And we don't have programs that focus specifically on animal genetics with that portion of training. It's kind of in the pool of everybody. But we support undergraduate scientists, even high schoolers, pre-doc, postdoc fellows with high success rates, and new investigators, of course. So with that, I would like to just say congrats again, Sue. This was such an honor to be here, and we had so many fun memories in the lab, both during your time in the lab and after. And this is one of my favorite here. I don't know if John sent me this. Was it you, John? Yep, John took this picture of us playing laser tag, just beating each other up. And we had so much fun doing those lab group socials. But also, Sue came to my wedding. She's met my kids, had us over, and, everything that she does in the way, it seems so intentional. And I've just learned so much from you. So with that, I would like to thank you.
Thank you, Angelica, for that very sentimental and informative time. We have time for a few questions. Let's close this. Okay. Sure, lucky day. Angelica, please repeat the questions.
Okay.
Will you go back one slide?
Non-discrimination.
So can you expand a bit about the data algorithms and those intents, considering how important those are going forward?
Yeah, and so we're starting to get more applications, I would say, in the animal breeding and genetics program that's really heavily focused on quantitative genetics and methods to improve our approach to animal breeding. And so I think that's a promising thing. We're seeing some more faculty members that are in that area because we didn't get too many applications in really heavy quantitative genetics in the past few years. So there are other opportunities besides the animal breeding and genetics program to work on kind of the data side of things. And one of those programs at the agency is data science for food and agriculture systems. And so they can support projects that focus on the data. So not necessarily, you're in the field collecting the samples or something, but what are innovative ways to deal with agriculture data that can be used outside of your species of interest as well. So their focus is on artificial intelligence. That's such a huge tag word at the agency, right? How does this apply to AI? Which is important. But yeah, machine learning, and they also have coordination innovation networks in that science, the data science program. So if there's needed the coordination for better data analytics, that would be a great program. And Juan Steibel had a coordination innovation network grant through that program on precision livestock farming, which was extremely successful and useful, and of course incorporated some animal genetics as well.
you seem to have benefited from the NSF REU program.
Yeah.
Been any thought to USDA following through with a similar program?
Yeah, so oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to repeat the last question, but this question's about the research education for undergrads program that brings undergraduates to research institutions that are highly successful and productive and gives them about 10-week, I think it was 10 weeks, right, Max? 10-week experience over the summer coming and working in labs and having research projects. NIFA did recently offer a REU, they call it REEU program that's modeled after the NSF program. So research, education, and extension for undergraduates is what it's called. And so they're trying to sort of replicate those efforts. And I've heard some success, but I don't think there's been too many grant cycles on that program yet. But that's a great opportunity as well to look at for animal breeding and genetics.
Okay, we're out of time for questions. Thank you, Angelica.
Thank you.